Okay, as I mentioned last week, and this wasn't anything that I was intending to bring, but then as I was putting last week's sermon together, I stumbled across remembering this. One of the things that I made mention of was the fact that sometimes it takes us to be challenged with something before we really dig into it to study it. If there's no challenge, if there's no question, there's so many other areas that we deal with that sometimes we really don't dig into it. Well, this was one where I was challenged back in 2014. And I delivered this sermon in September of 2014. And it's on the YouTube, but it's private. There were some things that I said in there that dealt with finances of some of the other churches that we fellowship with. I didn't want that on the internet. So I made this private. So while it's out there, the only people in this church that have ever heard this sermon that I'm aware of are those that were in the room in September of 2014. Now you think about it. We have 9 members that were here then that are still here with us today. 9. We have a church of 50 members. In September of 2014, the Meadows Church was still in full operation. We didn't have any of those people yet. We didn't have any of those non-residents. We had a small little church, and there's 9 people left that have heard this sermon before. And so when I made mention of it last week, I was intending to just send you a link if you wanted it. And then I thought, well, wait a minute, there's 40-something people that haven't heard this. The majority of the church has never heard it. And there are some people that have got some odd ideas about this. Now, I apologize that I'm preaching about money again, because I don't like to do that very often. But this was put together because of an attack that was being made by a former member of the church, and it forced me to really dig into this and take a look at it and see what the Bible's really saying about it. You know, I'm a firm believer that God knows who he's going to call to preach long before you're ever born. And as a result of that, I'm also a firm believer that all of your life's experiences are designed to train you for whatever it is you're going to have to do. And so if you're going to end up being a minister, your entire life, even though you don't realize it, you're being trained to do what you have to do. I'm not really a big fan of standing up in front of people. So you go back and look at my life, I started singing in Baptist churches when I was 4 years old. I've been standing up in front of people in one capacity or another since I was, as Daddy would say, knee-high to a grasshopper. Since I was 4. Then I ended up being a musician and on stage all the time. I ended up being a college professor and having to stand up in front. So my whole life has been this way. Well, there's another thing that I did where I was trained, and that was, a couple of decades, I was a real estate appraiser. Now, we have some loan officers and some real estate people in the room, and I know that this is going to make you mad, but the actual job of a real estate appraiser is not to hit your number to facilitate your loan. That's really not what we're supposed to do. I know there are guys that do that, but that's really not what we're supposed to do. We are supposed to compare apples with apples and oranges with oranges and find out what is really truly comparable to something else so that we can arrive at a credible opinion of value so that whoever our client is can assess the risk and determine whether or not they want to make the loan or build the property or whatever. So I've been trained at noticing what things are comparable and what things are not comparable. What is similar and what isn't. Remember, when we study the Bible, we're supposed to compare passage with passage. Well, they have to be talking about the same thing. And if you start to look at a passage that might be talking about finances, but has nothing to do with your topic, if you end up using that, you end up teaching the wrong doctrine. So what I'm going to bring to you this morning is a sermon that I did back in 2014 called Making Apple Pie. The nice part is we're not under attack right now, so I can soften this up and just preach it from the positive aspects so that everybody understands how this all works. So the person that was making the attack at that time was someone who seemed to believe that a minister's job is to work in a secular profession 60 or 80 hours a week and volunteer his time as a pastor of the church. That was kind of his position. He did not think that the church was supposed to support the minister. He didn't believe that. He as much as said that to me in private. I'm not gonna pay you. Okay, don't. I don't know why you would do that. That's not how you win friends and influence people, is it? To slap them in the face, then just keep it to yourself. If you don't want to, then just shut up and keep it to yourself. I won't know the difference. But he insisted on letting me know. Now, what's the Bible say about this? What does the Bible say about it? First, I want you to turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 9 through 14. As it is written, he hath dispersed abroad, he hath given to the poor, his righteousness remaineth forever. Am I in the right place? No, that's 2 Corinthians. Okay, got it out of the way. Have to do it once. Here we go. 1 Corinthians 9, beginning at verse 9. For it is written in the law of Moses, thou shalt not muzzle the mouth of the ox that treadeth out the corn. Doth God take care for oxen? Or saith he it altogether for our sakes? For our sakes no doubt this is written, that he that ploweth should plow in hope, and that he that thresheth in hope should be partaker of his hope. If we have sown unto you spiritual things, is it a great thing if we shall reap your carnal things? If others be partakers of this power over you, are not we rather? Nevertheless, we have not used this power, but suffer all things, lest we should hinder the gospel of Christ. Do you not know that they which minister about holy things live of the things of the temple? And they which wait at the altar are partakers with the altar? Even so hath the Lord ordained that they which preach the gospel should live of the gospel. God wants his ministers to live, to be supported by the people in the church that they minister to. And you wonder why. Well, I'll give you a good example. This sermon, I already told you I preached it in 2014. So I had the outline, right? Got the outline. I figured, well, that's easy enough. Just pull out the outline. I've spent 42 hours on this, on an outline that I already had, reworking it and re-looking at it and going through the verses and this job takes time. So if you work 60 hours a week as a secular job, what are you guys going to get? You know, I'm not the greatest preacher in the world anyway, so can you imagine what you get if I don't put 42 hours into this? You get garbage. You get leftovers. You go to one of these churches where the pastor is required to work a job and then preach on Sunday mornings. Wendy and I went to one time. It was the biggest bunch of hobnob, thrown together nonsense that we've ever heard in our lives. And I remember going home and telling her, if I sound like that, please tell me, I'll never preach again. It was horrible. But the guy didn't have any time to put anything together, so he just rattled off whatever was on his mind and amened it and closed the service. Look at Nehemiah chapter 13. No, that's back in the historical books. You've got 2 Chronicles, you've got Ezra, and then you get to Nehemiah. Nehemiah chapter 13. If you remember back in the Old Testament days, the Levites were not given land. Now, in an agricultural society, the way you make a living is by farming the land or raising crops or something. The Levites weren't given any land. It was the people's responsibility to give them of their fruit, so that the Levites could spend their time taking care of the service of God. That's the way it worked in the Old Testament. Now, in this passage, in chapter 13 of Nehemiah, beginning at verse 10, and I perceived that the portions of the Levites had not been given them, for the Levites and the singers that did the work were fled every one to his field. Then contended I with the rulers and said, why is the house of God forsaken? And I gathered them together and set them in their place, then brought all Judah the tithe of the corn and the new wine and the oil under the treasuries. You see, they weren't taking care of the Levites, and so God said, you're forsaking the house of God. And that's a serious crime for his children to forsake the house of God because they refused to take care of the Levites. So the Levites had to go out and farm on their own in order to be able to eat. So it's God's ordinance that those that preach the gospel ought to live of the gospel. And God's ministers should be paid by God's people, and they shouldn't have to work in a secular profession. Now, when I first got here, we only had 13 members in the church, so I did work in a secular profession. And it was around the time of, I believe, July or thereabouts, I was preaching a series on Elijah the prophet. And I became so convicted by that. I mean, I don't know if you ever understand that some of the times when I'm preaching, it hits me too. Some of those things, it hit me too. And I was thinking, here I am working a job where Elijah was sitting by a creek hoping that the ravens would be there to feed him, and God took care of him. Why wouldn't God take care of me? So I retired. And that was when this attack decided to show up. And the man started going around to other church members trying to convince them and form a confederacy that they don't have to pay the preacher. So Wendy and I were looking at possibly starving to death as a result of this. And that's why I put this together. But there is some good teaching in here. In 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 17, it says, let the elders that rule well be counted worthy of double honor, especially they who labor in the word and doctrine. Now, notice, those who are full-time in the ministry and that rule well are considered worthy of more honor than those who don't. This word honor comes from a Greek word time, which means a value or money paid. It's not honor in the sense of respect. It's honor in the sense of an honorarium. You know what an honorarium is? An honorarium is a gift that's given by way of honoring or paying respect to someone or something, specifically a voluntary fee for professional services which are rendered. So it's God's teaching that the minister that rules well is worth more than the guy that doesn't rule well, and especially the ones that labor in the word and doctrine, the ones that are full-time in the ministry. In Galatians chapter 6 and verse 6, it says, let him that is taught in the word communicate unto him that teacheth in all good things. Communicate comes from a Greek word that means to share. Look at Philippians chapter 4 and verse 15. Philippians 4 and verse 15. Now ye Philippians know also that in the beginning of the gospel, when I departed from Macedonia, no church communicated with me as concerning giving and receiving, but ye only. You see, none of the other churches were sending him any kind of financial support. Only the Philippian church was. Look at Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 16. Hebrews 13 and verse 16. But to do good and to communicate, forget not, for with such sacrifices God is well pleased. You see, it's a sacrifice. This form of communication, it's not communication in the sense of talking to one another. It's a sacrifice that you make. And like Paul said over in 1 Corinthians 9:11 that we just read, if we've sown unto you spiritual things, is it a great thing that we shall reap your carnal things? So it's the responsibility of the church members to support the church and the ministry. But if there's no direct teaching as to how much, how do we know how much? How do we know how little? How do we know? At what point is God happy? What do we have to do to make him happy? Well, first, my suggestion is this. Look at faithful children of God in the Bible for an example and see what they did. Second, look to the example that's set by your pastor and pastors of other churches and see what they do. 1 Peter 5, 1 through 3 reminds us that pastors are to be examples to the flock. An example is a precedent which may be followed or imitated, a pattern of model or model of conduct. Okay? Pastors that's one of the things that we do, folks. We teach and we serve as an example. Pastor Gerald used to tell me that you want to try to stay somewhere in the middle. You don't want to get way over on the right. You don't want to get way over on the left, because usually people will follow you like a formation of birds. You'll be out. Have you ever noticed that? You've got one bird out here and the rest of them all just kind of trail off like this. And that's the way it works in a church. So if you get too far over here, you're going to have people that fall off the edge of the world. Right? So I want to be right down the middle of the median strip on the highway so that everybody is still on the road, because and I serve as an example. So I've had members of this church that have run into problems and don't have the answer for it and have called me on the phone and said, hey, what would you do? Am I okay here? Can I do this? Is that okay? I've had people do that. And then I can give them my advice as to what I would do. So that's another example. So what's your pastor do? Well, what I do is I follow the example in the Bible, which I'm going to show you, as well as the personal example of my father in the faith and my father in the ministry. Both of those men did the same thing that I do, and I'm going to tell you what it is. Okay? So first off, I want to look at texts that teach giving to God. These are texts that teach giving to God's house for the purpose of supporting the church and God's ministry. These are apples. Okay? These verses are apples. Stay there. Won't behave. It's like Gibson sometimes. First, I want you to look at Genesis chapter 4, and I want you to see that this is an important, it does in fact matter. This is the first example of an offering to God, and it shows that what we bring does in fact matter. Genesis chapter 4, verses 3 through 5. And in process of time it came to pass that Cain brought of the fruit of the ground an offering unto the Lord. And Abel, he also brought of the firstlings of his flock and of the fat thereof. And the Lord had respect unto Abel and to his offering, but unto Cain and to his offering he had not respect. And Cain was very wroth, and his countenance fell. You see, it matters. God had given instruction through their daddy, Adam, as to what it was that he wanted, and Abel brought what he wanted. He didn't think this up on his own. He knew to bring of the firstlings of the flock. And Cain decided he was going to worship God the way that he wanted to worship God, and so he brought him a basket of fruit. Maybe it was a fruit cake. I wouldn't have had respect to that one either. Anyway, it matters. It matters. So let's look at offerings that were given to the church or to the ministry. First, Genesis chapter 14. We're going to talk about Abraham. Genesis 14, verses 18 through 20. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine, and he was the priest of the Most High God. So here you have a minister bringing bread and wine. Sounds a little like church, huh? And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be the Most High God, which hath delivered thine enemies into thy hand. And he gave him tithes of all. A tithe, that's a tenth. He gave him 10% of all that he had. That was the example of Abraham to this priest of the Most High God. Okay? So there's Abraham's example. Look at Genesis chapter 28, and we'll look at Abraham's grandson. Genesis 28, beginning at verse 20. And Jacob vowed a vow, saying, If God will be with me, and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and raiment to put on, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then shall the Lord be my God, and this stone which I have set for a pillar shall be God's house, and of all that thou shalt give me, I will surely give the tenth unto thee for God's house. Now, folks, these are the only two examples we got where it mentions a number. This is it. That's the extent of it. Two examples. Abraham gave a tenth, Jacob gave a tenth, and I realize it's only two witnesses. But the Bible says in 2 Corinthians 13:1 that in the mouth of two or three witnesses, let every word be established. So we got two witnesses. And we have no verses anywhere that contradict these two witnesses. And both witnesses say the same thing. And so when you add the witness of your pastor based on what he was taught by his pastor before him, now you got three witnesses. So this is sufficient for me. But these are the only verses I can find in the Bible that give you a figure. Okay? Now, there are blessings that are given to us conditioned upon our giving to the Lord for his work in this world. There are blessings that are given to us as a result of that. Look at Proverbs chapter 3, verses 9 and 10. Honor the Lord with thy substance and with the first fruits of all thine increase. And notice it says first fruits. We honor him with the first fruits. We don't honor him with leftovers. We honor him with first fruits. We are to give ahead instead of behind. We'll deal with this a little bit more a little later on. Where did I go here? Honor the Lord with thy substance and with the first fruits of all thine increase. So shall thy barns be filled with plenty, and thy presses shall burst out with new wine. You see, there's a blessing in there. You honor the Lord with the first fruits, and you'll be blessed as a result of it. The return on it, I can say this from experience, folks, the return on it is far and away more excessive than you could ever imagine if you're faithful to it. Far and away. Look at Malachi chapter 3 and verse 10. Because God challenges us here. He challenges us to prove him. If we don't believe him, if we don't trust him, then prove him. And in Malachi chapter 3 and verse 10, well, let's go back. Let's look at verse 8 to get the context. Will a man rob God? Yet ye have robbed me. But you say, wherein have we robbed thee? In tithes and offerings. Ye are cursed with a curse, for ye have robbed me, even this whole nation. Bring ye all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be meat in mine house, that's God's house, and prove me now herewith, saith the Lord of hosts, if I will not open you the windows of heaven and pour you out a blessing, that there shall not be room enough to receive it. You see, there's blessings in this. You do what God says, there's blessings in it. But let's look at the opposite. Look at Haggai. That's a couple of books ahead of Malachi. Haggai chapter 1. And we'll begin at verse 4. Is it time for you, O ye, to dwell in your sealed houses, and this house lie waste? Now, let me tell you what's going on here. The Jews had returned from the captivity. They were supposed to build the house of God. They didn't do it. They built their own houses. They took care of their own business, but they didn't take care of God's house. They didn't build it. They didn't finish it. They didn't do what they were supposed to do. So that's the context of this. Watch what happens when people aren't careful to take care of God's house. When God's children lose sight of what they're supposed to do, watch what happens. Verse 5, now therefore thus saith the Lord of hosts, consider your ways. Ye have sown much and bring in little. Ye eat, but ye have not enough. You drink, but you're not filled with drink. You clothe you, but there's none warm. And he that earneth wages to put it into a bag with holes. See, you go out and you work and work and work and work and work, and at the end of the week you got nothing. Why? Because you're not taking care of God's house. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, consider your ways. Go up to the mountain and bring wood and build the house, and I will take pleasure in it, and I will be glorified, saith the Lord. You looked for much, and lo, it came to little. And when you brought it home, I did blow upon it. Why? Saith the Lord of hosts, because of mine house that is waste, and you run everyone to his own house. You see, these people weren't taking care of God's house. And as a result, they suffered financially because of it. Think about that. Here you work on something for years to put this massive deal together, and you finally get it, and you bring the money home, and God goes, and it's gone. It's what happens if you don't do what you're supposed to do. Now, we've seen the example of Old Testament saints and what they did. We looked at Abraham. We looked at Jacob. What's the example of your pastor and his pastor before him? I take 10% of every source of income that I receive, whether it be from Social Security or retirement or out of the offering box or anything that comes my way. I take 10% of it. And I put it in an envelope in my safe that's marked church money. And I use that for expenses of the church. it doesn't make sense for me to take it and stick it in the offering box, because I take the offering box home with me. So that doesn't make any sense. But I take 10% off the top and put it in that envelope. And I've done that ever since I've been your pastor, and I did it before we ever moved down here. Because that's the example of Abraham and Jacob. And that's precisely what my father in the ministry did before me. In fact, he always referred to this as 10% money. That's what he always called it, was 10% money. I see people over here nodding their heads. That's what he called it, 10% money. Well, why would you call it 10% money if it wasn't 10%? Why would you call it anything else, right? He always taught me you take 10% off the top, put it away. Lay it by your side until you have to use it. So I have it laid by my side. Now, when I have to buy an airline ticket to go to Las Vegas, I'll take it out of the envelope and buy the airline ticket with it. And that's what I do with it. Now, I realize that I could give less than 10%. Just like you can give less than 10%. I have no way of policing this. I don't know what anybody makes, and I don't know what anybody puts in the box. God knows, but I don't know. But if I were to give less, then I could expect less blessings, right? If I were to say give a third of 10%, then I could expect 1/3 of the amount of blessings that I'm entitled to if I gave the whole 10%. And folks, I am greedy as heck when it comes to the blessings of God. I want them all. I want as many of them. In this job, I need them all. I have to have them to do this. What are those blessings that I'm talking about? Well, wisdom, knowledge, understanding, long-suffering, patience, financial security when things get tough. Those are blessings that I want. You know, we all have this thing that we pay here to the government in order for services in return, right? Every April 15th, I, like everybody else, fill out a tax return, and I actually pay quarterly. So 4 times a year, I send them a chunk of money, and then on April 15th, or usually before that, I file a tax return to pay the government for services that I receive from them, right? And every once in a while, I get one of these in return. Because in this case, I paid them $10.55 too much, so they refunded me, right? Now, what do I get for my massive amounts of money that I send to the government? Not much. I don't get a whole lot out of them. I own a home, so I pay taxes on my house, property taxes. What do I get in return for that? Well, I have a street I can drive on, I guess. Not a lot. Every time I go to the store, I have to pay tax in the form of sales tax for stuff. Do I get anything out of that? No, not compared to what I pay. Well, God's kingdom has a tax. And I pay that tax, and I get all these blessings on top of it. It's the best dollar I ever spent in my entire life. So that's my example, and that's what I do. Now, I want you to understand something. If you decide to follow this example, understand that you're responsible for it. Don't make a promise to God and not keep it. Now, you're not required to put all of it in that offering box, but you're responsible for the whole amount. So so if you decide, well, I'm going to do the 10%, but I'm only going to put 5% in the box, and I'll hang on to this other in case the church ever needs it for something, you're responsible for that. Don't commingle it. Don't stick it in your savings account. Don't use it for personal expenses. That belongs to God. Okay? If you put all of it in there, then you don't have to worry about that anymore. But if you only put part of it in there, you're responsible for the other part. So if you want the blessings, you do what you're supposed to do. Now, that's all we have dealing with apples. It's the only verses I can find in the Bible that actually deal with apples. We've got other verses that talk about finances, but they're not apples. And you're going to see this in just a minute. Turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 9. Beginning at verse 1. For as touching the ministering to the saints, it is superfluous for me to write to you. Superfluous, that means unnecessary, redundant. I don't really need to write this to you. You already know it, but I'm writing it to you anyway. Now, I want you to notice the first clue that this isn't apples. That's not an offering to the Lord. That's not an offering to God's house. This is a gift to saints in Jerusalem, as we're going to see in a couple of minutes. It was a gift to the poor saints that lived in Jerusalem at the time. So if this is giving to the local church, if these instructions are apples, then we're Roman Catholics. And Jerusalem is Mother Church, and all of the churches answer to her, which is not the case. All of the churches are independent. You've been taught that. We don't answer to anybody but the Lord Jesus Christ. We don't answer to Jerusalem. Jerusalem was a sister church. She's not a mother church. But this is talking about a gift that Paul was going to take to the poor saints in Jerusalem. Look at verse 2. For I know the forwardness of your mind, for which I boast of you to them of Macedonia, that Achaia was ready a year ago, and your zeal hath provoked very many. They were ready a year ago. If this is support to the local church, why are they still hanging on to it? He talked about this, and he gave these instructions over in 1 Corinthians. We'll look at that in a little bit. But a year prior, he had told them to get ready for this collection. Well, if that's money to support the local church, then why didn't they just stick it in the offering box? Why were they sitting on it for a year? I want you to notice that Paul's writing to the folks that live in Corinth. So this isn't a bunch of non-resident members that are living out far away that only make it to church every once in a while. Okay, these are people that live there and attend church, I'm assuming, on a regular basis. He wrote this letter to the church at Corinth. So he's talking to the people that live in Corinth. And Paul told them a year ago to start collecting this gift and keep the money by their side so it would be ready when the messenger arrived to pick it up. Now keep your fingers here and look at 1 Corinthians chapter 16. Verses 1 and 2. Now concerning the collection for the saints, okay, again, we're talking about the saints. As I have given order to the churches of Galatia, even so do ye. Upon the first day of the week, let every one of you lay by him in store as God hath prospered him, that there be no gatherings when I come. You see, he wanted them to lay funds aside for these saints in Jerusalem. And he was going to come pick it up, or send someone to pick it up to deliver it to them. That's what these verses are talking about, and that's what these instructions are for. Now, here in the Lakeland Church, we do have non-resident members here. We've got a bunch of them. And we have visitors as well that do lay money by their side, because I only go out there 4 times a year, and then when I go out there, they stick it in a box, just like we do here, and then I bring it home with me, okay? But that's not the case here. He's not talking about a bunch of non-residents. here. He's talking about the people that are there. So here's another question. If this is an apple, right? Support for the local church. Why'd Paul have to send a messenger to collect it? Why would he have them save it up for a year and then send a messenger to pick it up and take it away from them? If that's what it was. That's not what it is. We just looked at 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verses 1 and 2. Now look at verse 3. 1 Corinthians 16 and verse 3. And when I come, whomsoever ye shall approve by your letters, them will I send to bring your liberality unto Jerusalem. You see, I mentioned that. This was a collection that the churches were taking for the saints in Jerusalem, not to support the local church, not to support the minister. This is for poor saints in Jerusalem. This is not an apple, folks. This is an orange. You see the difference? We have giving to the church, and we have giving to other saints. And that's something that we should consider doing, that we should help our brothers and sisters in times of need, whether they're in our church or someone else's church. And these are the instructions that you follow for helping those other people, but it has nothing to do with the support to the local church. Look at Romans chapter 15, verse 25 through 27. And notice what Paul says here. But now I go unto Jerusalem to minister unto the saints, for it hath pleased them of Macedonia and Achaia to make a certain contribution for the poor saints which are at Jerusalem. So Paul was picking up the money and taking it to Jerusalem. And this is not the first time that he had done this. This is not the first time that he had taken a monetary gift to Jerusalem. Look at Acts chapter 11. Verses 27 through 30. And in these days came prophets from Jerusalem unto Antioch, and there stood up one of them named Agabus, and signified by the Spirit that there should be great dearth throughout all the world, which came to pass in the days of Claudius Caesar. Then the disciples, every man according to his ability, determined to send relief unto the brethren which dwelt in Judea, which also they did, and sent it to the elders by the hands of Barnabas and Saul. You see, that's not support for local church either. Those are saints contributing to other saints, because there was bad stuff going on in Jerusalem at this time. This was a tough time for people that lived in Jerusalem. Remember, in just a few years from now, Jerusalem is going to be wiped even with the ground. There's wars going, there's all kinds of problems going on, and the saints in Jerusalem were having problems. So Paul was out raising funds, if you will, to help those poor saints. But that doesn't have anything to do with supporting the ministry or the local church. These are rules for dealing with those types of situations. I'll give you an example. Here's an example of this. When I was ordained Pastor Gerald stood up and said, I'm paraphrasing, I don't remember exactly what it was he said, but they had put a box out for Wendy and me. They put a box out for us, and they said, whatever you feel like giving to them to help them, because they're moving across the country. They took up a collection for us. There was one time I remember in Detroit where the parking lot at the American Legion Hall where they meet was getting in bad shape with snow and all that kind of weather. They don't last like they do down here. And it needed to be resurfaced, and the American Legion Hall went to Pastor Mott and asked if there was anything that they could do to maybe help them. And Pastor Mott stood up before the church and said, we're going to take a collection to help pay for. These rules apply to this kind of stuff. We had a husband and a wife that lived in Colorado one time that we took up a collection to help them move here. You original members remember that. So these rules apply to that. These are the guidelines for that. These are not the guidelines for giving to the local church. These are guidelines for something completely different. So in these situations, these gifts are given according to what a man purposes in his heart, according to how he's been prospered. They're in addition to the support of the local church. They're not apples, they're oranges. If God lays it on your heart to help in one of these situations, then you help and you follow these instructions to do it. And that's how it's done. So understand something. If you take these instructions and you use these instructions to give to the local church, then you're making an apple pie out of oranges. Now, I don't know what that would taste like. I don't think I would want to make an apple pie out of oranges, but I suppose you could. But if that's what you're doing, that's exactly what you're doing. You're making an apple pie out of an orange. I don't know, maybe God likes apple pies made out of oranges. Now let's look at another example of oranges. Back to 2 Corinthians chapter 8. Now, in 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse 12, this is one of the verses that was thrown at me by someone. It says, for if there first be a willing mind, it is accepted according to that a man hath, and not according to that he hath not. Okay? And I've heard people that use this verse to justify not giving to the local church because while they might be willing to, at the end of the month after they paid all the bills, there simply wasn't anything left. So they'll use this verse, it's accepted according to what a man hath and not according to what a man hath not. Is that what that verse is saying? Is that really what that's teaching? Didn't we just look at a verse over in Haggai that talked about not taking care of God's house and what's going to end up happening if you do? If you don't follow through? You carry your money home in a bag with holes in it and God blows on it and you got nothing left? How many of you have ever heard me say that you need to pay attention to the context of a passage in order to understand what the passage is teaching? You don't jump into a passage 12 verses down from the beginning and yank that one verse out and build a doctrine on it. That's what they do with John 3:16. They ignore everything around it and use that one verse. This is not what that verse is teaching at all. In fact, it's the opposite of what it's teaching. Now let's look at the passage. Beginning at verse 1. Moreover, brethren, we do you to wit of the grace of God bestowed on the churches of Macedonia, how that in a great trial of affliction, the abundance of their joy and their deep poverty abounded unto the riches of their liberality. Paul's talking about a church here that was poor, and yet when it came to this gift to the saints that he was going to take to Jerusalem, they gave more than the churches that were rich. They did it with great liberality. They didn't hold anything back. They gave more than they should have. Verse 3. You know what? I'm reminded of another example. You don't need to turn here. I'll do the turning this time. But I'm reminded of an example over in Luke chapter 21, verses 1 through 4. And he looked up and saw the rich men casting their gifts into the treasury. This is Jesus. And he saw also a certain poor widow casting in thither 2 mites. And he said, of a truth I say unto you that this poor widow hath cast in more than they all. For all these have of their abundance cast in under the offerings of God, but she of her penury or poverty hath cast in all the living she had. You see, that impressed him. It impressed him enough to put it in the scripture as a reminder to us of exactly who he thought was doing what they should do. And it's exactly the same case with the churches in Macedonia. They were giving more than they should. Verse 3, for to their power I bear record, yea, and beyond their power, they were willing of themselves. These people were not only willing to give what they had, they were willing to go take out loans and sell possessions to give to the poor saints in Jerusalem. Verse 4, praying us with much entreaty that we would receive the gift and take upon us the fellowship of the ministering to the saints. They begged Paul to take this offering, and he thought it was too much. Look at verses 5 through 7. And this they did, not as we hoped, but first gave their own selves to the Lord and unto us by the will of God, insomuch that we desired Titus, that as he had begun, so we would also finish in you the same grace also. Therefore, as ye abound in everything, in faith and utterance and knowledge and in all diligence and in your love to us, see that ye abound in this grace also. What grace is he referring to? The willingness of these church members to give to others with such liberality. That's what he's referring to. Verses 8 through 10. I speak not by commandment, but by occasion of the forwardness of others, and to prove the sincerity of your love. For ye know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, that ye through his poverty might be rich. And herein I give my advice, for this is expedient for you, who have begun before, not only to do, but also to be forward a year ago. Does this sound familiar? A year ago? You think maybe this has something to do with that same gift that he was talking about in the next chapter? It does. This is an orange. One of these. Not one of these. Verse 11. Now therefore perform the doing of it, that as there was readiness to will, so there may be a performance also out of that which you have. In other words, you've been laying this by your side. Now do it. Finish it. Do exactly what you were supposed to start doing a year ago. And then we get to this verse that was mistreated. We'll take verse 12 and we'll read all the way down to verse 15. For if there be first a willing mind, it is accepted according to that a man hath, not according to that he hath not. The point here being, this church in Macedonia, they were willing to mortgage their property to give to the saints in Jerusalem. That's not necessary. It's not necessary to sell your possessions to give to these other saints. That's not what we're talking about. It's accepted according to what you have. You don't have to get more to give, not according to what you have not. Don't go borrow money to give to these poor saints. You don't need to do that. Verse 13, for I mean not that other men be eased and ye be burdened. See, I don't mean for you to take care of them to the point where now you're in debt. But by an equality, that now at this time your abundance may be a supply for their want, that their abundance also may be a supply for your want, that there may be equality. See, these churches up in Greece, they were prosperous. Not so much with the folks in Jerusalem. He was trying to just help out the poor folks, but he didn't want to make them poor as a result of helping out the poor. That was never required. As it is written, he that hath gathered much hath had nothing over, and he that gathered little had no lack. He's using the example of the manna. You remember the manna when they were wandering around in the wilderness for those 40 years, and God provided food for them so they would collect enough for that one day. And whatever they had, it was sufficient. It was enough. That's what he was trying to do. So you don't have to sell possessions. You don't have to take out loans in order to give to the poor saints in Jerusalem. Simply give out of what you already have. That's sufficient. That's acceptable. The idea of the collection isn't to make Jerusalem rich and the Gentile churches poor. That's not the idea of it. It's to just help the people. There was a famine going on in Jerusalem. There were problems. They had serious issues. And so this was a collection just to help them. So you don't have to go mortgage stuff in order to help them. Give out of what you got. That's fine. But this isn't an apple. These are not instructions for the local church. These are instructions for helping others in need. And we should try to help others in need whenever we can. Now let's look at one other case here. Because again, this was thrown up at me. Over in Acts chapter 4, we're not going to spend a lot of time on it, but Acts chapter 4, there was an argument made to me with one of the verses in here, because I've often said that what we have was given to us by God. That the possessions that we have, God is the one that actually owns the universe, and he's the one that we take care of those as a steward, but it all really belongs to him. So the intelligence that you have so that you can work your job, you don't think that came from God? He makes some people more intelligent than others. He gives some people abilities that others may not have. For whatever reason, and I don't know why he does it the way he does it. He knows, but everything you possess, everything you have, you owe to God, every single bit of it. Well, this fella didn't like that idea, and so he used a verse that we'll look at in a couple of minutes to try to prove me wrong. And so that's why we'll go over this passage, because this doesn't have anything to do with giving to the church either. Acts chapter 4, beginning at verse 32. And the multitude of them that believed, these are the disciples, were of one heart and of one soul. Neither said any of them that aught of the things which he possessed was his own, but they had all things common. And with great power gave the apostles witness of the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and great grace was upon them all. Folks, these are like the folks in Macedonia. Neither was there any among them that lacked, for as many as were possessors of lands or houses sold them, and brought the prices of the things that were sold, and laid them down at the apostles' feet. And distribution was made unto every man according as he had need. And Joseph, who was by the apostles was surnamed Barnabas, which is being interpreted the son of consolation, a Levite and of the country of Cyprus, having land, sold it, and brought the money and laid it at the apostles' feet. Now, where did this take place? Anybody got an idea where this took place at? Jerusalem? We just spent a whole bunch of time this morning talking about the poor saints in Jerusalem. Here you have the poor saints in Jerusalem. And there were things going on in Jerusalem. And they decided amongst themselves, this wasn't church policy, this was just some of the disciples that decided, you know what, why don't we sell what we've got and share it with folks? Because there are people that are hurting. That's a charitable thing to do, don't you think? Now, there is a reason. There's a backstory to this. Over in Matthew chapter 24, the Lord Jesus Christ, in the Olivet Discourse, had told the people in Jerusalem that within their very generation, Jerusalem was going to be destroyed and there wasn't going to be anything left of it. So let me ask you a question. If there was a Bible verse that said that within 20 years from now, a sinkhole was going to develop under Lakeland, Auburndale, Bartow, Plant City, everywhere around here, Riverdale, and swallow all of your property, and you were going to have nothing, how long would it take for you to pick up the phone and call your broker and have a for sale sign stuck on that property? If you believed, like these people believed, that within, it could be 2 years from now, we're going to lose this, we might as well sell it and share with the rest of the people, right? Now, where was the bank in Jerusalem? Anybody got any idea where the bank was? The temple. You're a Christian. You want to give your money to the Jews who hate you and would just as soon see you dead? I don't think you're going to get a lot of interest off of that. So we can trust the apostles, right? Give it to them. But notice, first off, this is an incredible story and a picture of charity and love towards one another. And something else that we notice about this church was growing like wildfire. 3,000 baptized one day, 5,000 baptized another day. It was growing by leaps and bounds. You think maybe being charitable helps a church grow? Maybe? Because it seems like the charitable churches are the ones that grow the most and grow the fastest. The ones that look out for one another, the ones that care for one another, the ones that take care of one another, those are the ones that tend to grow. And the ones that don't are the ones that tend to shrivel up and die. It's just an observation. I'm not teaching that for doctrine. Now let's look at the rest of the story, because it was the first half of Acts chapter 5 and verse 4 that was offered against my statement that God owns everything. Acts 5:4 says this, "Whilst it remained, was it not thine own? And after it was sold, was it not in thine own power?" So see there, Pastor, you're wrong. God doesn't own everything. The things I have are mine, not his. I owe him nothing. Well, you ever heard me say you got to pay attention to context? That that's kind of important sometimes? Chapter 5, verse 1. "But a certain man named Ananias, with Sapphira his wife, sold a possession and kept back part of the price, his wife also being privy to it, and brought a certain part and laid it at the apostles' feet. But Peter said, Ananias, why hath Satan filled thine heart to lie to the Holy Ghost and to keep back part of the price of the land?" Now, the issue wasn't that he kept back part of the price of the land. The issue was, as we're going to see later in this passage, he lied about it. So he sold the property for, $100,000. And he brought $50,000 and gave it to I'm just making up numbers. Gave $50,000 to the apostles and said, we sold the property for $50,000, here you go. And kept the other 50. Now, he didn't have to bring anything. First off, he didn't have to sell the property. That wasn't required. He didn't have to do that. Second, he didn't have to bring any of the money to the apostles if he didn't want to. But instead, he brought part of it and lied about what he sold the property for. And that was a problem, because he lied to the apostles. The apostles are the representative of God on this earth. He lied to God. And do you not think God knows better than anyone else what you really do and what you really did? Don't lie to God about these kinds of things. Verse 4, and here's that verse. Whilst it remained, was it not thine own? You see, you didn't have to sell this if you didn't want to. And after it was sold, was it not in thine own power? You could have decided how much to give. That's fine. Why hast thou conceived this thing in thine heart? Thou hast not lied unto men, but unto God. And Ananias, hearing these words, fell down and gave up the ghost, and great fear came on all them that heard these things. I can imagine so. And the young men arose, wound him up, and carried him out, and buried him. And it was about the space of 3 hours after, when his wife, not knowing what was done, came in. And Peter answered unto her, Tell me whether ye sold the land for so much. And she said, Yea, for so much. See, he asked the question of what Ananias had told him. Did you sell it for the 50 grand? And she said, Yep. Then Peter said unto her, How is it that ye have agreed together to tempt the Spirit of the Lord? Behold, the feet of them which have buried thy husband are at the door, and shall carry thee out. Then fell she down straightway at his feet, and yielded up the ghost. And the young men came in and found her, and carrying her forth, buried her by her husband. And great fear came upon all the church and upon as many as heard these things. You see, the problem was they lied about it. Don't lie to God. Don't make a promise to God and then not keep it. Don't tell him that you did something that you didn't really do. He knows. So their crime was trying to show the apostles how charitable they were, when in fact they weren't. They were lying about it. Now, obviously, this account in Acts 4 and 5, folks, it's not an apple. This is not an apple. This isn't even an orange. This is a tennis ball. This has nothing to do with any of the other, and the only reason that I brought it up was because this was something that was argued to me about this topic. So now, we saw some verses that teach how we support the local church and the ministry, with the example of following in the footsteps of Abraham and Jacob, and using a pastor as an example. And those are apples. So now we know what apples are. We've also seen verses that give instruction on how and when we go about supporting others in need, whether they're our own church members here or whether they're members in another church. And those are oranges. They're not apples. And then we saw an example of grace of a new church in Jerusalem and their love for each other, having all things in common during a time when the church was growing by leaps and bounds. And that's not an apple or an orange, that's a tennis ball. And if you want to make an apple pie out of a tennis ball, it's probably going to be kind of chewy. So if we consider giving apple pies to God to support the church and the ministry, doesn't it seem feasible that we use the verses that are apples and follow those, and leave the ones that are describing an orange for occasions when we need to use an orange? Now that's what I found when tearing this thing apart so many years ago, and that's what I'm giving to you this morning. And now you know the difference between apples and oranges and tennis balls. So when you're making your offering to God, use apples. Don't use tennis balls, oranges or papayas or nectarines or apricots or anything else. Just look to apples. And you know what, folks, I'm sensitive to the fact that sometimes that seems hard to do. Sometimes that idea is hard to do, and you may not be in a financial position to be able to do that right now. And if that's the case, then make an apple pie with whatever you got, even if it's a small apple pie. That's better than an apple pie made out of an orange. So make a small apple pie and ask God to help you and so that you can make a full-sized apple pie someday. You're going to be the one that benefits from it. And that's a promise from God. And there's a bank that I'm willing to invest my money in that bank, because it won't ever fail like the rest of these will. With that, I thank you for your very kind and patient attention this morning. Let's stand and be dismissed in prayer.